Over the years, being in creative spaces, cultural spaces, and very different rooms, I've noticed a pattern that keeps repeating. People don't just perform work or talent, they also start performing pain, identity, and even success itself. And once that happens, it quietly reshapes what other people expect of you and who you're allowed to become. This is Dirty Chai Media, a space for understanding human behavior and meaning. My name is Q, and I break down the patterns underneath how people relate, seek purpose, and navigate the world. Let's get into it. In a lot of creative and cultural spaces, especially among artists, pain is real. Expressing it can be authentic, but I think there's a shift that happens when expression turns into repetition for recognition. At that point, the story actually stops being something authentic and something that somebody's lived through, and it actually starts becoming something that they're expected to reenact and thus becomes performative. From the outside, it looks like authenticity. Underneath, it often becomes self-extraction, turning your own story, vulnerability, and wounds into a consumable identity slowly becomes a performance that hardens into a personality. And when growth happens internally, audiences, workplaces, and families, social groups often don't know how to adjust to that. So you're basically like locked into this role that you have created for yourself through performance, outgrowing a role that once kept things stable. You see this often in like Asian family dynamics or South Asian family dynamics, sometimes even a lot of Black households where people are more attached to and love the role that you play in relation to them rather than valuing you for a human being and for the person that you are. When they're not interested in your inner world and your thoughts and opinions about things, and not only are they not interested, but they also don't understand when you do speak to them. And then they kind of act like it's a chore to cater to your emotional needs when you do have them. You're expected to always show up in one specific way. So if you're like the life of the party, for example, right? They love you when you're the life of the party and you're catering to them, making them laugh, helping them to have fun, creating a dope atmosphere for the night. But then when it comes to you being down, it's gaslighting, minimizing, dismissing, calling you dramatic. I've also seen some Middle Eastern families also reflect these dynamics. That's actually called enmeshment by psychology standards. You also notice this in rap and pop culture sometimes, where the audience loves one persona of an artist and they don't really ever let them grow or grow up. That also works conversely too. So it's not always the audience, but it's sometimes actually the artists where they play out this persona rather than growing up and maturing into a different sound and growing as a person, which is going to be reflected in your music too. So we see that a lot in rap and pop culture as well. I've noticed that trauma doesn't just fuel expression. It actually trains people to be palatable, impressive, and useful, which feeds into the performative nature of things like being an artist or some of these high functioning people who are externally successful, but internally are performing for self-worth or to be approved by parents, family, their environment, sometimes their social circles. And I've also noticed that this pattern shows up frequently in people who grew up early, having to function early, having to stay composed or carry emotional weight, often without support. So parentified children, for example, eldest daughters, for example, where you kind of end up being the emotional regulator for other people, but you don't actually have somebody that supports your emotions or is able to actually hold them. Children of immature parents or emotionally immature family members as well. So we already talked about some of the cultures that this shows up in. And in some families or cultures, silence is rewarded here. Pain is often managed privately, if at all, right? It's more about the external image. How are you performing? How do you look? Image is protected when safety is not. And when that conditioning carries into adulthood, performance no longer feels like acting. It feels like responsibility. And because it works, it rarely gets questioned until your nervous system can't sustain it anymore. There is a cost to this over time. When your identity is built around performance, whether you're an artist or just a person navigating the world, your nervous system becomes fragile. Validation doesn't actually regulate. Seeking fame and success, the validation of other people doesn't end up regulating you, it intensifies. And if you're looking for attention to heal the wounds on the inside of you, attention doesn't actually heal, it just exposes. And people watching from the outside often confuse visibility with stability. So it actually becomes harder to grow when you build your life around performance, even as an artist. And this isn't limited to art. It shows up in careers, families, leadership roles, and in relationships when someone is the strong one. That's why it's important to be equally yoked. But the key is to be aware. And how does awareness help? It starts with recognition. Once you see the difference between expression and performance, space opens up for you to grow. Healing doesn't erase the past, but it loosens its grip on identity. Creative work or contribution can still exist, but it doesn't have to be a survival mechanism. Similarly, you don't have to be a victim for the rest of your life. And often you can actually continue in the same field with more freedom because you're doing it from a place of wholeness and healing. When people heal, they realize that their skills translate better elsewhere in ways that support long-term health rather than extraction. I think it's important to note here that sometimes when you heal, everything that you built around survival and performance, you actually start questioning because your tastes change, your nervous system and what feels good and peaceful and right for you actually changes. Neither outcome is failure, just recalibrations. When pain or identity becomes something that has to be performed, growth often feels like a threat. Awareness interrupts that loop. And awareness, quietly, consistently, paired with action toward healing and wholeness, can actually create freedom. Where in your life are you performing a role for validation for yourself or for other people, even though it no longer benefits you? Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in unpacking human behavior and meaning, where we break down the patterns underneath how people relate, seek value, and navigate the world. See you on the next one.